I wanted to make a brief video talking about the most fundamental differences between the Chinese and English-speaking Western European approach to political science, to politics in practice. These differences, to some extent, exist in ancient philosophies, but they primarily exist in the minds and attitudes and beliefs of people here and now today. So, to give an example, the influence of the work of the Shang Jun Shu, the Book of Lord Shang is all we call it in English. It doesn't really matter if you want to construct in your mind a fable that this has some kind of broad cultural significance that the average Chinese person knows or that somehow reaches children in their cribs or as a fable. The reality is we have plenty of evidence of political leaders, including an historical figure like Mao Zedong, studying it and writing essays on it in school. It has very real political influence here and now, even though it is a part of classical or ancient Chinese culture. So in the same way, you could construct a theory that the philosophy of Machiavelli may or may not be influential in Italy today. I don't know. Maybe Machiavelli is more influential in Italian politics than he is in American politics or French politics or something. Another example would be Napoleon Bonaparte. How many politicians today have read anything written by Napoleon Bonaparte or written about the history of Napoleon Bonaparte? I think in Western culture that certainly would be a specialized area of study before you would make the claim that the historical experience of what happened with Napoleon was influential today. But on the other hand, as we all know, there are some texts and there are some sets of ideas that no one would really question the significance of. Everything I'm talking about here in terms of East and West is on that level of self-evident obviousness. And yet I think if you'll stick with me for just a few minutes, the three fundamental points I'm going to make in this video probably were not all that obvious to you. Point number one is the contrast between the great centralizing tendency of the Chinese Empire and the balance of powers theory in European and Western civilization. It is so commonplace as to be a meaningless canard that Europeans, when teaching, when giving university lectures to one another, in Europe and the United States, it's so commonplace for them to say, oh, the unique thing about the history of China is this obsession with unifying the empire. And there are quotations that are rolled out. The empire united must be divided. The empire divided must be united. This sense that somehow the course of Chinese history is an epic struggle to unify this enormous territory that's linguistically and culturally diverse and can never be fully unified. What I find lacking is any honest appraisal of what you are contrasting this to. So I was just talking to my girlfriend about the political history of India. It would be very different if we were having an honest appraisal of the political history of China over, let's say, just a 1,000-year period to the same period of 1,000 years in India or the same period of 1,000 years in Europe. And I found all of my professors in departments of politics and in departments of Asian studies really incredibly reluctant to have this sort of honest reckoning. And look, let's admit it right now. What's the ultimate taboo? What does nobody want to talk about? What is situated geographically right in the middle in terms of trade routes between China and Europe, between India and Europe? It's Arabia. Have you heard of Saudi Arabia? It's one of the most powerful countries in the world today. It's one of the most influential empires, wave after wave of Islamic imperialism. What about that over a period of 1,000 years? Can we compare that to China? Is China really obsessed with conquest and centralization compared to, say, the Mughal Empire, compared to any of the Muslim empires that rose and fell? A lot of these people, including professors here in the Department of Asian Studies at UVic, that I have some sympathy for, that I like as people, they're utterly lacking in any kind of down-to-earth, reasonable, contrasting approach to talking about politics this way. And it's in that down-to-earth, reasonable way that we should approach all politics. What is the contrast between China's supposed obsession with unifying and centralizing the empire and what happened in Europe. Just 300 years ago, Europe was completely dominated by the concept of the balance of powers, and they fought wars again and again, not to establish any one empire having hegemony over all the rest, but on the contrary, to preserve a perpetual balance of multiple, roughly equally powerful empires, each being counterposed against the other. Austria could not be allowed to unify with Germany, the German states plural. Why? The balance of powers. Why was the nation of Belgium created? We recently saw the Museums of National History in Belgium and military history. Why did they create Belgium? Because the British and the Russians and other foreign powers, but especially the British, said, no. If we allow Belgium and France to become one country, France will be too powerful. If we allow Belgium and the Netherlands to become one country, if we allow Belgium to become part of the Dutch Empire, then the Dutch Empire will be too powerful. We must preserve the balance of powers. What would happen if Spain and France became one country? It was going to happen. It was prevented by a war that all of Europe basically participated in, ended with, as I recall, the Treaty of Utrecht. France and Spain had to be prevented from unifying. And in a bizarre way, even the stage managing of power from Rome on a small scale within Italy and the Mediterranean and the whole of Europe. The idea of keeping more or less equally balanced powers constantly at each other's throat was the core of European political science. It was hardwired into our concept of diplomacy, our concept of even why aristocrats exist, and why aristocrats intermarry, and why they're negotiating with each other. And it is, in a word, complete madness. It's a formula for perpetual war within Europe and also without Europe, outside of Europe, in South America, North America, the colonization of Africa, the colonization of Asia. And it's a very strange parallel universe history to ask, how would any of these things have played out if we had just allowed Austria and Germany, not just Austria, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, which was much bigger than Austria, to unify with the German states? Why couldn't France and Spain become one country or one empire? Why couldn't the Dutch and the Belgians? I don't even care. Why couldn't we have formed larger or even just one empire, one emperor, one democracy, whatever you want to imagine, for all of Europe? It was because of the fascination with the balance of powers ideology, utterly a part of an aristocratic worldview in Europe, that has now in some ways disappeared. I would say the last sincere proponents of the balance of powers ideology were the people who used to surround me in academia, the people who sincerely lamented the end of the Soviet Union, the end of communism in Europe, because it meant the end of a quote-unquote multipolar system in which the Soviet Union held the United States in check and the United States held the Soviet Union in check. And many countries around the world were allied with one of these two poles. That is a balance of powers mentality. The assumption that the world would be a better place if it were constantly on the edge of nuclear war, and if places like Afghanistan had body counts exceeding 1 million because of the struggles between different branches of the Communist Party to control it and various anti-communist machinations to drive out the communists, etc. The incredibly blood-soaked history of Afghanistan during the Cold War. Of course, I could throw in here examples of Cambodia, Laos, Vietnam, the many other places around the world where the Cold War was not really so cold, but quite hot. Not even to mention South Korea versus North Korea, etc., etc. It's madness. That is the balance of powers ideology. And I can say to you sincerely, I have never once been at a single political science lecture on any period of European or Western world history that even questioned the balance of powers ideology. Everything else has been questioned, including just war ideology, European imperialism, all kinds of things. But the balance of powers notion is one of the most influential in our culture. And it's only from that perspective that it seems like madness that all of China should have one capital city. What's so crazy about that? It means that no two provinces of China are at war with each other. That's very fundamentally what it means. It means they have one army and one currency, one form of economic unit of trade, etc., etc. As you guys know, with the history of China, it definitely doesn't mean they have one language. It doesn't mean they have one church. They didn't have a Roman Catholic Church. They didn't have those other forms of unifying and oppressive elements. So I think this is still today one of the most powerful warping factors in terms of mutual perception and misperception of Europe versus the Chinese world. Number 2 on my list, these are a little bit quicker, the last 2 of the 3, is the concept of rule of law as such. There were a lot of misconceptions about this. I think Europeans like to imagine that in Europe alone, we have this really high estimate of the value of the rule of law, whether that is attributed to the Roman Empire or maybe some local king, Charlemagne in France and Germany, or whatever, some beloved king in the history of England, that somehow Europeans value the rule of law and the Chinese do not. This is false. It is true that the concept of rule of law is different in Europe, China, India, and the Muslim world. That would be a really great 4-way comparison to teach political history. I've never seen it done. But if we're just contrasting China to Europe, the text I already mentioned, the Shang Jun Shu, the Book of Lord Shang, is this really useful, really rapid introduction to statist attitudes towards law and order in the history of China. And again, Mao Zedong personally read it and was influenced by it. I think every single politically sophisticated person in China studied this, either formally in university. I think the Book of Lord Shang is more widely read in China today than the United States Constitution is read within the United States. Not that many people in the United States have read the Constitution. A good percentage have, don't get me wrong. So it is a really mega influential work. And in that book, the Book of Lord Shang, it's stated with a brutal simplicity that can never be translated, that you are better off being ruled by a bunch of gang rapists. I'll say a bit more why it says that in Chinese. You're better off having rulers who are a bunch of gang rapists, but who follow written law, as opposed to having good men or the best of all possible men, but who rule personally, who just rule as men without the rule of law. This is a paraphrase from memory, but as you can imagine, one of the things that stood out to me when I first read that, I was looking at the English and the Chinese, is this the use of the word for rape in there. And I do think it's really specifically alluding to the fact that, like in most ancient cultures, in pre-modern China, conquest was really linked to rape and gang rape. And you see that throughout pre-modern literature, that when a city was conquered or sacked, we use these things, the sack of Rome, we use the word sack and looted, and that looting and pillaging and conquest did really involve rape. And it was gang rape by military men. So it was not in some abstract sense that you were saying being ruled by a bunch of gang rapists. The type of people who conquered and came into power by force very often were men with that kind of background in their resume. But it's saying what really matters is written law above all else, before all else. That having an evil man, again, it's not even that implausible, having a conqueror who's committed unspeakable atrocities. That's how he came into power, which is often true at the start of a new dynasty in China or after any given war. The winners, the people who came out on top, the winners and the people who came out on top may have been the most brutal, the most ruthless, the most unscrupulous. They've committed atrocities. But what's crucial in separating them from mere bandits who've come into power is the belief in written law. So I have to say, this is something where I feel like Western political science, political philosophy, just mainstream politics, has almost inverted the role of East and West. I don't feel we have that. And again, I mean, it's surreal to say Mao Zedong personally was actually profoundly influenced by this too. It may have been true in ancient Athens. That's actually a topic for another video I'd like to talk about. What was the role of written law in ancient Athens? But there's no doubt that today, in every Western democracy I'm familiar with, it's the moral character of the people. It's the spirit of the men, the particular men or women who hold office, who interpret the law in the Supreme Court. The same one sentence fragment in the law in the Supreme Court we feel can be interpreted one way or another. It can grant gay people rights or it can deprive them of rights, this with no change in the written law. I think, if anything, we're living through a period of time where there is less faith than ever in the Western world in written law. And we all hang on the notion that we can choose morally good people in whom we place our faith, hope, expectations, and optimism, including, hilariously, someone like Barack Obama, who utterly failed to deliver on his election promises and so on. Got the Nobel Peace Prize anyway, so on and so forth. So that is a very fundamental element. And I think it really can be said, if you asked, what today do Chinese people have to believe in? Not communism. It's a joke. You think they don't know? Then they can't look around. You think they can't read, the Little Red Book by Mao Zedong? They can't look at what communism is supposed to be and the reality of what their economy and society is. Do you think they can't see the difference between communism in theory and their capitalist society in practice? You think they're unaware of that? But something they can believe in is written law, the rule of law. And they do have that affirmed. We just had another case, I'll get the guy's name wrong, of the guy, his net worth, the amount he took in briberies was over 100 million US dollars. The numbers are unbelievable. But every time, and it's under Xi Jinping, it happens all the time. Every time an elite member of the government is even executed, but stopped, put on trial, thrown in prison, tortured, executed for taking bribes, and so on. This doesn't affirm your belief in communism. This doesn't affirm your belief in particular men ruling in government. That's not what the faith is in. It's the idea that written law has a validity intrinsic to written law as written law, apart from the men, even if they are terrible people, individually, collectively, as a social class, or what have you. That the value of law is something that stands quite separately from the value of men who implement it. Number 3 has to do with the role of both dissent and scientific progress. Now, I will just point out, all the time I say things, and then I Google them because I think someone else must have said it before me. And again, I'm shocked no one has made the point before in the English language or that I can find through Google. So this may be something I'm the first person to say. There's a really important sense in which political dissent and scientific progress are one and the same thing. In Western culture, Copernicus and Galileo, right? And so Copernicus and Galileo, the fundamental discovery that the Earth goes around the sun, the design of the solar system, inverting the assumptions of the Catholic Church. This is, yes, it is in part a scientific discovery, but its whole significance for us in Western civilization, and again, every erudite person knows this story, definitely in Europe, I think to a lesser extent in the United States and Canada. It's a crucial turning point in the history of European civilization, the emergence from the Dark Ages into the Renaissance. So the scientific breakthroughs that really begin with Galileo, or at least how we imagine it, how we tell the story, how we tell the fable, begin with Galileo standing up to the Catholic Church. What is Galileo? He's a dissident being persecuted and put in prison by the government. Yes, by the church, by an era when, government and church are pretty much one and the same, right? He doesn't just symbolize scientific progress. He symbolizes political dissent. And again, even if it is fictional, that is how we imagine Charles Darwin. I'm not going to give 100 examples here, guys, but you could. We imagine Charles Darwin, and even guys who just invent new technologies, new forms of engineering, but we imagine Charles Darwin as standing outside the church and outside of government and writing these shocking treatises, these shocking new political ideas, and then him being a dissident and the establishment inveighing against him and so on, and in the end, the truth must win. This is really the Western narrative of scientific progress. And that idea is utterly lacking in Chinese civilization. Not that the thing in reality. Now look, it's a fable. It's a fable in both the East and West. How did the United States put a man on the moon? Was it because of a dissident standing outside the White House and saying, "You politicians don't know how to put a man on the moon, but I do"? Was it because of a figure like Galileo? A dissident, complaining against the government or something? Was it the plucky underdog standing up to political power? No. An unbelievable amount of taxpayers' money was poured into a government program that was completely hierarchical and top-down. A lot of scientific progress comes from the center, comes from the elite levels, and is handed down. And the point is here, the Chinese, in terms of how they remember the history of scientific progress and the relationship between authority, the government, the emperor, even religion, in as much as Chinese religion is this diffuse tradition of Buddhism, Confucianism, and Taoism and other sources. No, for them, the concept of even scientific progress, but I think all progress, is something radiating out from the center, top down from the hierarchy, and where they fundamentally do not value dissent the same way we do, because they do not think of dissent in terms of progress and even science in the way that we do. Okay? Those are my 3 points. Not an exclusive list, but a list of 3 really important fundamental differences in the Chinese versus Western, European, English-speaking approaches to politics. Not just in ancient history, right now in the 21st century.